We have another entrant in the plus size four-wheel drive ute race in Australia, and this time it's the Ford F-150. So this is going to be competing with the likes of a Ram 1500, Chevy Silverado 1500, as well as the Toyota Tundra in Australia. But the interesting thing I think about this car is that actually this is one of the most popular new vehicles on sale every year in the world. In America alone, they sell 900,000 up to 1 million of these vehicles every single year. That blows me away because in Australia overall, every single car, that's about the same number. So this thing, hugely popular in America, but does it make sense here in Australia? Well, we've got one to find out. And we've also got a caravan. We're gonna do a tow test and we're gonna run you through everything that you need to know about the Ford F-150. Let's go for a drive. The 2024 Ford F-150 we have here is the short wheelbase variant in the cheaper XLT trim level. So this is the entry point into Ford's big American ute range. It's priced from $106,950 plus on-road costs. This makes it $995 cheaper than the long wheelbase variant, but opting for the up-spec Lariat is an expensive procedure. You're adding $33,000 overall to the asking price if you go for the Lariat over the XLT. Standard kit here is relatively basic, however, especially when you consider the asking price of the vehicle. There's halogen headlamps up front, LED tail lights and 20-inch wheels on the outside, along with cloth seats and electric adjustment on the inside. The pedal position can be electrically adjustable as well, and there's manual tilt and reach adjustment through the steering column. There's a relatively small 8-inch infotainment display and 8-inch digital instrument cluster in this XLT, and that brings native navigation, digital radio and Apple CarPlay Android Auto connectivity. There's regular old cruise control here with no adaptive functionality for the XLT. There's also no front parking sensors and also a reversing camera only, no 360. The XLT gets a column-mounted gear shifter here, as well as tyre pressure monitoring and a fold-out desk over the center console area. Under the bonnet is a 3.5-litre twin-turbocharged EcoBoost V6, which makes healthy figures of 298 kilowatts and 678 newton meters. This runs through a 10-speed automatic gearbox to a part-time four-wheel drive system. The F-150 also gets a feature called Pro Trailer Backup Assist, which can help with reversing trailers and keeping visibility going. However, this does require the driver to punch in a few details about the trailer, but also you need a range of cameras installed into the trailer and properly connected to the vehicle. So it's a base spec Ford F-150, but it still costs over $100,000 before on-road costs. So I'm not going to call this a cheap workhorse. Now, one thing I want to point out straight off the bat here, you still get stuck with halogen headlights on this F-150 XLT. And I don't know about you, but I think if I'm spending $100,000 on a car, I don't want to see halogen listed anywhere. This would be much better if it actually had LEDs, especially for the asking price. You get a little bit more of a basic look, I suppose, in comparison to the Lariat. There's a bit of chrome still getting around, big Ford grille on the front there, and you still get 20-inch wheels in this model. They are a different design in the Lariat, but still 20s there. They're a Hankook Dynapro. They're a light all-terrain tire, so that might be good for a bit of off-roading, but I'm sure a lot of people will be upgrading those themselves. Now, in terms of size overall, we do have the short wheelbase model here. So if you want more space overall, you're going to be looking at the long wheelbase model. That can be had as an XLT, also as a Lariat. But if you're going to tow like we are today, I would get some more mirrors because these are actually reasonably small overall, and they don't give you a bit of width in terms of visibility that you need if you're towing a wide trailer. So replace these for some clear views or something like that, or bolt on some that you can buy from your regular auto shops and that sort of thing. But otherwise, let's have a look at the tub, because I think that's a really important part of why this XLT might make sense for some buyers. So we've got a big rig here, and the good news is you've got a lot more load space in the back of this F-150 in comparison to a regular ute. The payload isn't that big, however. You're still looking at under 800 kilos across the board, regardless of which spec you go for. But let me just open up this tailgate here. I'll show you a few features. It's damped, but it's also reasonably heavy still, quite a big chunky bit of gear. Now you've got some rulers here on the back, and you've also got a spot to throw your pen and maybe a drink or something like that. This does work as a sort of pseudo workbench, I suppose. I do really like Ford's spray-in tub liner that they've got in this car. So this is ready to have a ton of bricks thrown straight into the back. Not a ton actually, because then you'll be overloaded, but a whole lot of bricks thrown in the back. You're not going to damage that. It's got a nice finish to it, looks really good. But also you've got a bunch of tie down points in the back here. So I count 4 on each side, which is actually really good. You've got a bit of versatility there, and these big cleats on the side, they're a really handy size for fitting large ratchet straps and that sort of thing. Another thing I've noticed, they've actually got a key barrel on them. So on the keys of the car, you do have this here, and they are lockable and unlockable in terms of being removed or taken off. So never heard of someone actually stealing a tie down point, but there you go. You can remove those. You do need the key. One more thing I do want to point out, actually, this is a pretty cool feature. You do have a spot to put something like a C-clamp there, but also press this button, pull this out. Now you've got a handy dandy step for getting up and into the back without any issue. So that is a pretty handy thing to have. Here's the interior of the F-150, and it's important to remember that this is the XLT model. So even though you are paying over $100,000 plus on roads, you're not getting all the bells and whistles that you would expect in the Lariat model, which is a fair chunk more expensive. But one thing you do get a lot of in this car is just space and storage as well. Let me start here with this center console. Really big chunky lid, which I'll get to in a second, but that opens up to a really, really big storage space actually. You fit a lot of stuff in there, tools, whatever it might be. But then you can also click this, and that flips forward as well. That turns into a bit of a workbench, I suppose, for you. You could throw the laptop on there, you could work away, you could fill out paperwork, whatever it might be. If you're spending time on the road and working out of this car as a bit of an office, that could work really well. You've got 2 cup holders here, space for pens and that sort of thing, and then just a big storage spot for whatever it might be, measuring devices, tools, phones, whatever it is. More storage up the front, USB, USB-C power, USB, USB-C power again, plus a 12-volt outlet there. So you've got heaps of power outlets. You've got 2 glove boxes here in front, and being such a big vehicle, the amount of storage you get, just even in the door bins, is massive. There's a bunch of different areas there. You can fit bottles, you can fit all sorts of things in there. So in terms of storage, naturally this is a big car, but it does feel quite practical. Now the seats, these are cloth, but they do have electric adjustment, and you've got a fair amount of movement going on here. So you can dial yourself in pretty comfortably. You don't get the leather and you don't get the heating and ventilation of the Lariat. But for what it's worth, I think these are pretty comfortable. There's plenty of under thigh support. They're a nice wide seat, so they feel quite loungy and comfortable. And you also got a thing that's pretty cool. On top of having tilt and reach adjustment through the steering column, you also get adjustable pedals in this car. So that is electric. There's a button down here. You can actually move the pedals in and out, and that's really nice if you want to dial yourself in for a long drive behind the wheel. You can get everything in pretty much the perfect position, I think, regardless of what sort of size you are as a driver. Now, in terms of infotainment, you get the small screen in this XLT. The Lariat gets a larger screen, and it does feel quite small for a couple of reasons in this car. Firstly, the car's so big. This screen, even though it's actually not a bad size, it just feels small, I think, and there's a lot of real estate around where some larger space could be. And you've also got to remember that even a base spec Ford Ranger these days that costs around half the price of this has a screen that's about twice the size, a nice big portrait screen, really good system as well. So this does feel a bit last generation, a little bit underdone, I think, especially in comparison to the asking money. You only get a reversing camera in this model. The image is okay, it's good enough for hitching up and that sort of thing. There's Apple CarPlay, there's Android Auto, there is native navigation as well. There's a whole lot of features as well in here to do with towing, which is really worth knowing. What you can do is actually dial in the size of your trailer, and that will help with things like blind spot, warning, and that sort of thing. And you've got a dial here that will actually help you reverse the trailer without having to do steering wheel inputs yourself if you're not the most confident in terms of reversing at the tip and that sort of thing. A little bit further down you have integrated trailer brakes, and then your driving modes there, the usual range of driving modes. There's a locking rear differential as well, and part-time four-wheel drive. But we'll worry about the driving impressions a little bit later. Next, let's jump in the back and see what the space is like in there. Now, before I hop into the second row of this F-150 and show you how much space there is a lot, by the way. I just want to show you one feature. You can fold these seat bases up, which is pretty handy because now you've got a huge amount of storage space in the back here if you don't need room for passengers. Obviously, you've got a big tub in there, but if you want to keep things a little bit more secure and out of the weather, you've now got a huge amount of space in here. You could almost have a picnic, I think, in the back. You've also got a bit of space under here for storing some bits and bobs underneath the seats. But in terms of folding the backrest down, that only happens on this side. So this one folds down. You can see the top tether points. There are 3 across the back here, and that gives you access to the tire changing equipment. There's a scissor jack and all the other stuff there as well. But now let's hop in. As you can see, surprise, surprise, there is mountains of space in the back here. That's my driving position up front. I'm a little bit under 6 foot tall. I sit a little bit close to the wheel, but that doesn't matter in the slightest here because I mean, I've got almost half a meter of knee room on offer. There's plenty of headroom as well. The seats are pretty comfortable, not hugely lounge-like and salubrious, I suppose, but comfortable enough. Now, in terms of materials overall, this F-150, it might surprise people in some ways because it's a little bit of a utilitarian take on the F-150 overall. If you want the nicer materials and that sort of thing, you'll have to spend a bit more to get the lariat. We've got a lot of hard plastics. Some feel perhaps even a little bit flimsy in some places, to be honest with you. It's the same up front as it is in the back, but this is a working vehicle, don't forget. It just happens to cost a whole lot of money because it's so big. But let's have a look at some other things here. We've got 2 cup holders up front. They're a little bit of a reach because we've got so much room in the back here. There's USB, there's 12 volt, there's USB-C as well, along with a couple of air vents and map pockets. There's also cup holders here in the door, which is a handy thing. There's room for bottles and some storage and bits and bobs in the doors as well. But otherwise, I mean, if you're looking at space, width in particular, you could definitely fit 3 big adults in the back here with no issues at all, child seats and that sort of thing. This is certainly a step up over what you'd get in a Ranger, for example. But at the same time, it's not a hugely special experience inside here either, in terms of the materials and that sort of thing. This is a working ute at the end of the day. All right, let's talk powertrains first, because I think that's an important thing to talk about with this F-150, and I'm sure a lot of people who buy a vehicle of this size probably want a V8 just because there is that part in your brain there that's really hard to ignore. But I've got to say, if I had to choose between this engine and the Ram 1500 with the 5.7 litre V8, I would choose this because no, it doesn't sound as good, but it has more torque in more places. So we've got a twin turbo V6, it's 3.5 litre, so that is a similar, it comes from the same family, I suppose you could say, as the Ford Ranger Raptor in Australia, but this is the bigger engine, and we've got a lot of torque available here, over 650 Newton meters in fact, so that torque is available all the way through the mid-range there. Power overall feels pretty good, but you never feel like you really have to rev this thing out to get it moving, and that's what I think I like about it the most. I've got a 2.5 ton Caravan on the back at the moment, and this car, generally speaking, isn't raising a sweat. Fuel consumption is creeping upwards, of course, with that sort of weight, but I've got to say this engine, it feels nice and relaxed all the time, which I think is exactly what you want if you're going to be looking to tow or haul things around all the time. This is a really nice powertrain. And a big part of that is also the 10-speed automatic gearbox that we have here. It's calibrated pretty well. It allows this engine to rev really low most of the time. As you're cruising around, this thing barely gets over 2,000 RPM. And because you've got 10 speeds available, when you're on the highway, this thing is barely ticking over 1,000 RPM, to be honest with you. It's almost at idle, and it just cruises along really happily. And I think that's really where this engine is in its happy place, and it works well. Press the pedal down a little bit more, and then it drops the ratios pretty quickly as well. It'll almost skip ratios quite quickly actually to give you a bit of motivation. And of course, you can also select the towing mode, which forces this car to hold on to its ratios for a little bit longer, which is great. It makes the car just a little bit more usable, I think, especially when you're towing in traffic and that sort of thing. You don't feel like you have to wring the car's neck as much to get it moving. And in terms of the driving experience, you feel the size of this car in comparison to a Ranger. It's noticeably wider, you feel like you're in a taller position. Visibility is pretty good overall. If you are towing with these mirrors, I do suggest that you get some replacement mirrors or bolt some on the side that give you a bit more width, because these aren't wide at all, to be honest with you. They're the same size as most cars, I think, but visibility otherwise is quite good overall. So it might take a little bit of getting used to with the size of the vehicle, especially if you're driving in the suburbs and that sort of thing, but out on the open road, it is a different story. And the ride quality of this F-150 is quite good overall as well. In comparison to a Ute, it feels a little bit less jiggly, especially now I've got a bit of weight on the back of it, but even when you're unladen, this car just has a bit more ride comfort than you would expect from a regular size four-wheel drive Ute in Australia. Now that's for a couple of reasons. This has a relatively low payload, a little bit under 800 kilos overall, where some dual cab Utes have a payload of 1,000 kilos or something around that mark. So this doesn't have to account for as much weight through the suspension, but at the same time, you've actually got a bigger wheelbase, you've got bigger tires, and just generally speaking, a larger vehicle that seems to soak up bumps a bit better than a dual cab Ute of a normal size would. So even though it is a bit of a handful in terms of size around town, it is very comfortable to drive in terms of ride comfort. It's also reasonably fuel efficient as well. That's one advantage of this V6 in comparison to a larger naturally aspirated V8. I actually had this at under 10 litres per 100 while cruising along the highway. Now I've been driving around town and doing towing. That's getting up to about 12.5, 13 litres per 100, which for a petrol vehicle of this size is still impressive in my book. I think in comparison to a Ram 1500 or a Chevy Silverado with a bigger V8 once again, this would be probably the more efficient option out of those, or however, the Tundra would have something to say about that. All in all, this F-150 does impress in terms of the driving experience. I love the engine, I love this V6, it's got torque all the way through that mid-range, exactly where you want it. And once you get your head around the actual size of the car, the driving experience is comfortable and surprisingly refined. Well, as you'd expect, this Ford F-150 is a fantastic tow vehicle. We've got 2.5 tons on the back at the moment, but this thing is capable of towing 4.5, so it's barely broken a sweat. I really love this twin turbo V6 petrol engine in this car. It works well for towing, but it's also pretty good to drive around town. But at the same time, it's not all a home run, I think, this car. It costs about twice as much as a base spec four-wheel drive Ford Ranger, and I'm not sure if I feel like I'm getting twice as much of the vehicle at the same time. As a tow vehicle, yes, it's much better, and it's got a lot of space inside and a lot of comfort and that sort of thing, but I think the interior, the technology, and a few things like these halogen headlights do let the Ford F-150 down a little bit. You might feel like you need to spend up even more into the Lariat to get a more complete vehicle overall. So while this F-150 is impressive, I do feel like the Lariat might be the better one to buy, even though it does cost a lot more money. Now, let me know if you enjoyed this video. Give us a thumbs up and let me know any comments you've got down below there, any questions you've got about this Ford F-150. And if you want to see the full review, head over to Drive.com.au. And as always, thanks for watching.